Broadcasting and 2, 1. Hello, and thank you all for joining us for this virtual summit presentation on identifying at-risk students with Hawks reporting and analytics. My name is Shriver Hasbrook, and I'm a training and support specialist here at Hawks Learning. Our speaker today is Professor Curtis Mitchell of Kirkwood Community College. Professor Mitchell has been the Director of Developmental Math at Kirkwood Community College in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, for the past 8 years. He has led the development of an Emporium-style developmental math program and has been active in the national conversation around course redesign. We're excited to have you all here with us today. Now, if you have any questions during this webinar, please use the Q&A answer box down. It'll either be located on the bottom panel or the top panel of your screen. And we'll address all of these at the end of the talk. And on that note, I'm going to hand it over to our presenter, Professor Mitchell.
Thank you so much. So as you said, I'm Curtis Mitchell. I teach at Kirkwood Community College, or at the moment I teach for Kirkwood Community College because I won't be physically at the campus for a while, as I imagine is true for most of you. So I'm broadcasting from my home. So if you hear any forlorn yowling, it's just my cat objecting to my having gone through a door and closed it behind me. All right. So hopefully everyone is ready for this talk. Here's what I want to do. I want to give you a brief overview of how our course model works, just so you can have an understanding of what we're doing and why being able to identify students who are struggling is particularly important to us. Talk about what our methods are for getting and keeping students on track. Strategies for identifying successful and at-risk students, including Hawks reporting tools and then some custom things that we do. I want to talk about interventions and how we work with students who seem to be struggling or at risk. Some issues I've been thinking about and how to approach that. And then allow plenty of time for questions at the end. So that's the plan. I'm based on our main campus in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. There's an aerial view. You can tell it's pre-coronavirus because there are lots of cars. We also have an outlet campus in Iowa City, and I'll talk just a little bit about what they do there that's a little different from main campus. So we use an Emporium model, where the idea with the Emporium model is that we have an individually paced curriculum, so students may move through it at different rates and spend more time working on some topics than others, based on mastery, which in our case essentially means that they need to get 80% on everything, the certified mode for each lesson in the software, and then on each test to move on. We use minimal lecture, so students spend most of the time on computers and then working one-on-one with instructors and tutors as they have questions or as there's something they're getting to that we want to go over with them. Our students do attend class at a specified time with an assigned instructor. So some people, when they use Emporium model, are thinking more of a drop-in model, where students are supposed to come in and work in a computer lab at any time. There's maybe an expectation for hours per week, but there's no assigned meeting time or instructor. We didn't go that way, partly because if our students could come whenever they wanted, they would all come between about 9:30 and noon, and we'd be overwhelmed. But also we thought and continue to think the relationship with a specific instructor that our students have is really important to keeping them on track, helping them have some accountability, and also someone they're comfortable reaching out to if they have trouble. The format we run this in varies a bit by campus. At Cedar Rapids, we have a large computer lab that seats about 100 students. So we'll run 2 to 3 sections in there at a time. At Iowa City, which is a smaller outlet campus, they meet in computer classrooms. So there's just one instructor working with up to about 25 students. And when we initially set this up, which was back in 2011 at this point, we chose the Hawks software based on the built-in mastery approach, the overall ease of use for both students and instructors, and the level of support we could get from Hawks. And that's been consistently a standout if our instructors or students call Hawks with questions about anything. They're very responsive, they're very helpful, which has not necessarily been our universal experience with calling helplines. We have a set of courses that all take place within the same curriculum framework. So we have our material sections into modules, which correspond to chapters in the second edition of Hawks Preparation for College Math. So we have a pre-algebra class, which covers modules 1 through 5, basically pre-algebra topics. Preparation for College Math, students who start at this level start in module 3, which is fractions, and it goes through linear equations. And then they can continue on to Algebra Mastery 1 and 2, which together correspond to more or less the curriculum of intermediate algebra. We also still offer a more traditional lecture-based intermediate algebra class as an alternative for students who get to that point and decide they don't want to continue working in the lab setting, or who need intermediate algebra on their transcript for transfer purposes. The carrot we will able to offer our students who are working in the pre-algebra through Algebra Mastery 2 sequence is that if they finish multiple classes in a semester, we will give them credit for the extra or additional classes without charging them for another course. So a student who starts in Preparation for College Math Module 3, but then continues on and completes all the way through Module 15, would receive 9 credits for Prep for College Math, Algebra Mastery 1, and Algebra Mastery 2. We don't have a lot of students who do that, but we do have some. And it helps relieve some placement anxieties with students and advisors if a student is placed below the level they wanted to be at, but we can offer the option that, you know, if you put in the effort, you can complete both these courses. It's a nice alternative for them to have. Our first couple years of doing this, a major theme was adding more structure and guidance to the course. I think initially we just gave them sort of a recommended overall schedule and said, okay, students will look at the schedule and figure out what they need to have done. And then we found that that was not, in fact, the case. That students needed a little more structure than that. So we did go through and assign due dates, and I'll talk a bit more about where those due dates came from in a minute because it ties into a Hawks report I want to show you. When we moved to the online version of the Hawks software, the web version, which is the only one now, it has a to-do list feature that I want to show you if you haven't seen it, because it's been very helpful in helping students keep track of what they need to do. Because we can have students who are trying to finish an extra class, we have a set of alternative schedules basically saying, okay, if you're trying to finish both Preparation for College Math and Algebra Mastery 1, this is where you need to be at a given point in time. And one thing we also learned from the first semester we did this is that a lot of students don't necessarily know where they need to get. They're like, okay, my advisor told me to take this class. I think there's another class I have to take after it, something math. So we do a lot of sitting down and talking with our students, and either talking through what they need if they're, say, a liberal arts major, or if they're in a specific program, encouraging them to talk to their advisor and find out where they need to get. We've also done a lot of work with advisors to make sure they understand how this math class is structured and functioned, so they can pass on correct information to students and tell them things like, no, you really still need to come to class, even though it's not a lecture as such. So this is a shot of the Hawks to-do list. So the Hawks to-do list just lists all the assignments for the class, but as an instructor or administrator, the assignments can be organized into folders or groupings. Here they're organized by module and ordered. So here we can see that this particular student, looking at their to-do list, has done everything they need to do in module 3, but it looks like they've completed lessons 4.1 through 4.5 in module 4, which is why they're no longer appearing on the display, but they're overdue on 4.6 and 4.7, and then we have a set of written concept questions for each module. It looks like they need to complete those and then to pass the module post-test. So this is really helpful and is the view we try to direct our students to whenever they're in the software, because it really does list off for them everything that they need to do and those lesson due dates so they know when they have to get them done. Here's an example of one of those alternative or suggested schedules. So this would be for someone completing modules 3 through 11, which is preparation for college math and algebra mastery 1. It tells them that they'll receive credit for those 2 classes, and then just has a breakdown by week. We have everything due at the end of the week on Sunday night to keep things consistent, because we have different course schedules, some evening classes that meet 1 night a week versus classes that meet the regular 2 or 3 days a week. So to be able to use the same due dates for everybody, we just set them for Sunday. And then this just has essentially all the same information on the to-do list, but with the schedule we'd like them to get through it to be able to finish module 11 by the end of the semester. And this schedule is basically built based on information from a Hawks report that I'm going to show you, where we actually use the median time that students take to complete each lesson to sort of schedule out the various lessons so that they should, if they stick to this schedule, be doing approximately the same amount of work every week. Okay, so I want to talk about sort of the core subject of this course, which is how do we identify at-risk students, and then what do we do once we've identified them? So I want to talk about 3 major predictive factors, none of which are probably going to be super surprising to many of you. But what I want to talk about is how we can use the courseware and the information we have to really narrow down who are the students we should be worrying about on this and how can we reach out to them. So one of the major predictive factors is students who've made previous attempts at the course. And this is something new instructors tend to find surprising or counterintuitive, because one aspect of the module-based course structure is that if we have a student who finishes, say, modules 3 and 4 in their first semester in preparation for college math, that isn't enough for them to pass the class. They need to get through module 7, so they would get a failing grade. But they do retain their module completion. So if they came back the next semester, they would start in module 5. So a returning student who's taken the class before will often be coming in with less to do than an entirely new student. In an extreme case, they might have finished 4 of the 5 modules and just have 1 module to complete. So the intuition that people have is that these students would be more likely to finish because they have less left to do. But in fact, as you can see from the table, students who are taking the class for the second or a subsequent time have a much lower chance of passing. And this actually, when we've broken down the data and looked at, is it their second attempt, third attempt, fourth attempt, the more times they've tried to pass the course, the less likely they are to pass it. So one piece of information it can be useful to flag for instructors is which of your students are reattempting the course. And in our case, it's pretty easy to see because they'll often be the students who are coming in with work already done. You'll see that they have modules already completed. A second predictive factor is just how quickly are they moving through the material. So are they staying on or ahead of pace early in the course, or do they seem to already be dropping behind? And I'll talk about how we can track that in the software. The third predictive factor, and actually the strongest predictive factor to how they're going to do, is attendance. In theory, students can complete everything but our tests from anywhere, or anywhere with internet access. They can go through all the lessons and certifies at home. They can do the written concept questions at home. So technically the only thing they need to be on campus for is the tests. But in fact, what we found is students who don't come to campus generally don't make it through the course. We think they need, both the accountability and the encouragement and just the structure of being in class on a regular basis. So Hawks has a really extensive suite of reports. This is a screen you'll see if you go to the Hawks gradebook and click on reports. I'm going to talk about a subset of them. I think I have had occasion to run every one of these reports as the administrator for our Hawks classes. Maybe not the attendance ones because we don't use the Hawks attendance system. But I've circled some of the ones that I particularly want to talk about because they're either ones we use a lot or ones that are relevant to tracking student progress. For a more traditionally formatted course where your students are all supposed to be doing the same thing at the same time, a report you'd run a lot in the upper left is all student scores. We don't tend to run that one as often because it's a more traditional gradebook view. And when you have some students in chapter 5, some in chapter 3, some in chapter 6, having a traditional gradebook where you need to scroll back and forth to sort of find them isn't as helpful. If we want to look at a specific student, nothing beats the detailed student grades report, which just gives you essentially the full gradebook information for a particular student to answer just about any questions you have about what assignments have they completed and when. So I'm going to look at reports that let us get a view of what all our students are doing at once, which is the category most of these fall into. The report I most recommend that my instructors run on a regular basis is the weekly assignment completion report. So weekly assignment completion is bottom of the second column of reports. And what this report does is let you enter a range of time. It doesn't have to be a week, it just defaults to that. And show all the assignments that each student has completed during that period of time. So for privacy reasons, I've blanked out the student names, but each box on the left corresponds to an individual student. So you can see that I have one student of mine who completed lessons 12.3 and 12.4 during the week. This is from 2 weeks ago. I have a student who completed lessons 3.7 and 3.8. I have a student who completed lesson 9.8, did the module 9 review, took and passed the module 9 post-test with a score of 95.74, and then went on to do lessons 10.1 through 10.9. So when I looked at this, I made a note that I should definitely check in with this student and say, really well done, because it's an impressive amount of progress for a week. And then I have a couple students who each did one lesson for the week, which is generally too slow a rate of progress to get through the class. So the conversation I had with those students was more, you know, I see that you made progress and I'm glad that you did, but probably you need to move quicker. You need to put in a bit more time. If you want to get details on how a student is spending their time in the class, the time per student report, which is again in the middle column, 3 from the bottom, gives you a breakdown of how your students spent their time during any given time interval, and how much time was spent on a lesson by lesson basis. So here I can see I had a student who was working on early lessons from 1-7 to 1-11. I can look at how much time they spent in each lesson and how that time broke down between learn, practice, and certify. In this case, I have a student who's spending a fair amount of time in learn and practice and then certifying on their first attempt, so getting credit for the lesson the first time they do it in the certify environment. I'm hoping people are familiar with what I mean when I say certify. If you're not, please ask in the Q&A and I can amplify a bit. In this particular, so for some students, I'll see them spending hours in certify and no time in the other modes. And there the conversation is, I think you would probably learn the material better and get through it quicker if you spent some time in the practice mode, in the learn mode, before you're trying to complete the certify. In this case, the student is spending plenty of time in the learn and practice mode. Given how easily they're then getting through certify, I might even suggest that they see if they can get by with a little less time in practice, moving to certify a little earlier. Another report is the time in lesson statistics. This report gives you an overall snapshot of how your students are doing at completing lessons and how long those lessons are taking. So in this case, I've actually run it because we let students carry through their progress from semester to semester. We don't clear their accounts at the end of the semester. We move them all to a section called inactive. And they can't test from inactive, but it preserves all their grades. So in this case, I've run this on the inactive session to get an idea of, for all our past students, how much time did they spend on each lesson? So we can see in the students column the number of students who worked on each lesson. You may see there's a jump up in the number of students when you get to 3-1. That's because we have so many preparation for college math students starting in module 3, plus the pre-algebra students who would have started in module 1 and continued on. And it'll give us, for that group of students, some statistics on the time they spend in certify and the total time they spent in the lesson. So the due dates and the suggested schedules I showed you earlier are all based on this report. We basically look at what's the median amount of time that students spent in that lesson, and then use that to assign each lesson a weight, and then try to put equal weight of assignments on each week of the course. There's a little bit of fiddling we do with the numbers to reflect that later modules are a bit more difficult, and the numbers can be thrown off by the more successful students or the more mathematically comfortable students being there. So if students are trying to do multiple courses worth of material, we'll scale up the time for the later lessons a bit, so they're not spending all their time in fractions and then they get to factoring polynomials and are feeling like they have to rush through it. In general, I think we always try to err on the side of having them do things earlier. mouse wheel went a little nuts there. Search by criteria is a more recent report and a really useful one. This lets you find students who meet a certain set of criteria. So you can look for students with a specified overall grade, students who haven't logged in for a given number of days. So you can look for students who aren't active, students who spent less than a certain amount of time in any lesson or web test. You can select either in a range of times. Students who've attempted to certify at least a given number of times. So the report's useful in identifying students who meet a criterion. It also gives you some data about that group of students. And whoops, my attempt to anonymize didn't blank out the email addresses. So I'm gonna move on, but it just, I'll fix that on the slide. But it gives you a breakdown of time spent in lessons, which you can also get from time per student, and time spent testing, which is important for us, because especially early on, a student can be spending most of their time in class testing. So looking just at lesson time, it looks like they're not moving very quickly, but looking at total time, their total time is pretty good. So this is a diagram that I use in talking to newer instructors about how to work with the information you're getting from these reports. And nothing here, again, if you're an experienced teacher, you won't find this surprising, but I think it's a useful way to conceptualize how you would take this information and convert it into interactions with students. And you can certainly expand this grid and do a 3x3 with a moderate version of each, but I wanted to keep it relatively simple. So 4 possibilities. If we have a student whose progress is low, they don't seem to be moving forward very quickly, and whose time on task is also low, then we're looking at a student who probably needs to spend more time on the class. So this is a situation where we would intervene and talk to the student or reach out to the student, because these are often the students who aren't in class, and see what's going on. And it could be any number of things. They could feel like they've been struggling with material and gotten frustrated. Life or other courses could be happening. Maybe they fell behind because they missed some classes and then they felt awkward or guilty about coming back to class. So the message here I would try to send is basically, right now you're not moving forward at a rate that will help you be successful in this class, but you can be successful in this class, and I want you to be successful in this class. Let's talk about how that can happen. And sometimes that message I find is successful in getting students to come back. And sometimes it's successful in getting students to say they'll come back and then they don't, because sometimes whatever factors are operating are still there. But we try to keep reaching out and communicating that they can still catch up for as long as that seems possible. One of the most interesting groups, I think, are the people who are making low progress but have high time on task. So the problem isn't that they're not putting in time. The problem is that they're not getting the progress that would correspond to that time they're putting in. And that's a very frustrating situation for students to be in. So these are probably my highest priority to intervene with. I may already be talking with them in class, but I need to think about, what does a student need to be successful that they're missing? Do I need to give them more support? Do I need to talk to them about tutoring, other resources for getting help, coming into the lab outside their classroom time? Do they need resources they don't have? Do they have learning issues that haven't been addressed with our accommodations folks? Or do they need just some guidance on how to spend productive time with the software? I had a student who would spend literally hours in the learn mode, basically lovingly copying into a notebook everything on every slide and then working through the problems, which was great, but it was eating up all their time. And in some cases, you know, if the material wasn't challenging for them, it was overkill. They didn't need to be recreating those slides in notebook form. So just talking through what's a good balance of time. At the opposite extreme would be the student who's spending all their time failing to certify, and talk about, there's a learn mode, there are example videos, you can practice the problems. Maybe you should spend more time on that instead of plunging straight into trying to complete them for credit. The high progress students I'm generally less worried about, but I do try to have a discussion with students who are making lots of progress in very little time. And the question there is basically, could the student be completing more material if they put in a bit more time? If they're able to sail through preparation for college math at modules 3 through 7 class, spending 1 hour a week, would it make more sense for them to put in the extra hours a week to get credit for Algebra Mastery 1 as well? The exception to this would be a student who's making enough progress to finish all the modules with a low time on task. That student was probably misplaced, so if I caught them early enough, I would talk to them about retaking the placement test and seeing if we can get them into a different course. But otherwise, my role there is pretty much limited to cheerleading, which I like doing. So, high progress, high time on task, that's great. Everything is good. So in that case, just as much positive feedback for the student as I can give, to let them know that I'm seeing that what they're doing is working, and that they should take pride in that. We do some custom reporting, and everything we do on our custom reports is information that can be found in Hawks reports. But I do this basically as a service for our instructors to try to put information in front of them that they're going to need in as accessible a format as possible, so they don't have to spend as much time looking at individual student reports, and they can focus on reaching out to students who need help or thinking about strategies to help students who need help. And in a lot of cases, an engaged instructor will already know which of their students are behind, who's in good shape. But my instructors have told me, and I also feel like it's really helpful to just have all this information in one place. So this report, we call the progress report. I run it and send it out every Friday at the end of the day. It lists student names, and the student names on this are actually hyperlinks. So instructors want to email a student, they can do it right from this report. And what it does essentially is look at the percentage of the course material that they've completed. And that again uses those weights we use to build schedules. So some lessons are worth a higher weight because we know it takes students longer to get through 8.4 applications of systems of equations than it takes them to get through solving one-step equations. So this looks at what percentage have they completed, compares it to what they had completed a week ago on the previous report, so you can see how much they've moved forward, and then classifies them as red, green, or yellow based on both how far are they along compared to the percent of the course that has gone on. So this was run about a third of the way through the course, so the student should be at close to 33%. So if it's really less than 33%, it says they're way behind and goes the red. If they haven't made recent progress, that affects how they get categorized. And then it also displays the last login and the last assignment completion date, and then what was that most recent assignment they completed. So the way I build this report is by using another report from the Hawks reporting screen, printer export grades, which lets you just dump a bunch of information about students into comma separated value file or Excel file. And then I also exported a report called last assignment completed, which is right next to the weekly assignment completed. And it basically does what it says on the box. It tells you what's the most recent assignment each student in this class completed. And then I do some Excel processing to produce this report. My Excel processing is super clunky because I'm not a programmer, but it works. So if you're just working on your own class, all that exporting is probably overkill. But if you're working with a group of instructors as an administrator, being able to process data like this can be helpful, and it doesn't need to be something very involved. So I mentioned attendance as a predictive factor. And we have the advantage in our large lab, we have a card reader, and we ask students to swipe in and swipe out when they come into the lab, and then again when they leave. So we can track how much time students are spending in the lab. So in fall 2017, we started assessing part of the grade based on time on task. And what we were doing that semester was looking at either attendance. They were supposed to spend essentially the equivalent of class time in the lab each week. So they would get a grade that was the percent of that time. I think 150 minutes would meet the requirement at 100%. So if they did 75 minutes, they get a time on task score of 50% for the week. Or at that time, they could fill the requirement with Hawks minutes. If they spent 300 minutes in Hawks, then we would also give them time on task credit for the week. And I had a student complain, why do I have to spend less time if I'm coming into the lab than if I'm working from home? It feels like you're rewarding me for coming to class. And I was like, yes, that is what I'm doing. So we looked at the relationship between those time on task scores and student success. And what we saw, and this is something that makes us really good, feel really good about our course model, is that for the students who averaged high time on task scores, the pass rates were extremely high. So for people who had a perfect time on task score, meaning they did at least the 150 minutes every week, or instructors are able to use their discretion letting students make these up. If they're out sick one week and they want to say, if you do the minutes the next week, the extra minutes the next week, I'll count them, they can do that. But for those people with perfect time on task scores, almost all were successful in the class. For the people with time on task scores of 90% or better, 89% of them passed the class. So for the students who are coming and doing the work or doing the work elsewhere, we saw really good success. The problem is we have too many students over at the tail of this graph who weren't putting in the time and weren't being successful. So for that week, we sent out, for that semester, sorry, we sent out a weekly email that would basically break down their time in the lab, their time in Hawks, and what their time on task grade was for the week and why. And then give them contact information, remind them who their instructor is, and so they can contact their instructor if they think that, you know, they forgot to swipe out one day, so some time didn't get logged. So we did this for a semester, but what we found was that saying that there's an alternative to minutes in the lab, that you can do it with minutes in Hawks, was taken by students as sort of a de facto admission that you don't really need to come to class. And most of those students who were like, oh, I'll just fill my time on task with Hawks minutes, didn't actually spend the time in Hawks, which they weren't spending time in the lab. So the subsequent semester, we changed it and just took off the minute in Hawks option. So now they're required to be in the lab or make alternate arrangements with their instructor to get the time on task credit. And that has seemed to do better in terms of promoting attendance. So getting students into the lab to do math is still our #1 challenge. So what do we do with students who are at risk or have fallen behind? So a couple things we try to do when we know a student is at risk There's some automated contact that happens in addition to the progress email you just saw, which is a mail merge I send every Friday when I do reporting. There's an automated progress email that goes out about every 4 weeks that just sort of breaks down, here are the assignments you have and haven't completed, and here's how it looks like your progress currently stands in the course. We report a pass-fail midterm grade at midterm, so the second progress email also says, based on your progress so far, it looks like your midterm grade will be passing or failing. If your midterm grade will be failing, then here are some resources, and here's what you need to do to catch up. Personal contact is also really important. Students are contacted by the instructor. We've also had a pilot program where, since the lab has so many students in it, during our busy times, we have an advisor who comes and sits in the lab once per week and can talk to students if they have questions about, well, what math would I need for this program I'm thinking of changing to? Or what would be the effects on my financial aid if I dropped this class? For advising information like that. And they've also, for those groups of students, done some outreach to students who are struggling to offer them advice and encouragement. And that's been a nice added source of that. We try to keep students engaged. The more engaged students are in the lab, the more likely they are to keep showing up. So try to make sure there's plenty of student-teacher interaction. My general goal is that I have some sort of meaningful interaction with every one of my students who is present for every class session. Sometimes they spend the class session taking a test, and then there isn't much that can happen. But just making sure that I'm having, helping them go through some material or having a conversation that goes beyond just, hey, how's it going? Fine. We try to encourage some student-student engagement. So if students are working on similar material, guiding them to sit near each other and to check in with each other as a first line if they have questions and the instructors and tutors in the lab are busy. The more personal your relationship with your students is, the more they feel like you're someone they know and have had conversations with, the more likely we find they are to persist. Two components that are important for keeping up student morale. Students need to believe it's possible for them to make progress. The best way to convey that is to help them make progress. And it's important that students can see that they're making progress. The to-do list is really nice that way because it will come up with assignments saying, done, done, done. We also encourage them to check them off on the due dates or suggested schedule of handouts. Because for some students, I have to admit, if I have a list of things to do and I get to cross things off it, that feels pretty good. And for some students, that can be really motivational. This is an example of that progress email. This is one I send later in the semester that just lays out, here's what you still need to complete. In this case, it says it looks like you're behind schedule, so you may want to talk to your instructor or me about your options. This is another mail merge. It's pretty easy to send using the information I pull for reports. Certainly an individual instructor could reach out to individual students, either with a mail merge or just by sending individual messages. And I want to close by just saying a couple words. One thing I've been thinking about and wrestling with of late when I think about identifying at-risk students and reaching out to them is, how do we make sure that in labeling students in our own minds, if not to them, as at risk, that we're not creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. So one potential issue here is what's called stereotype threat. The definition is that it's the threat of being viewed through the lens of a negative stereotype, or the fear of doing something that would inadvertently conform to that stereotype. This is a neurobiological reaction that causes students to perform less well on assessments. Research has shown that if groups which are stereotyped as being poor at math are reminded of their membership in those groups before a math assessment, that they tend to perform worse. So in identifying students who are at risk, what we don't want to do is put a label on them that's going to reinforce any self-perception that they're not good at this, that they belong to a group that struggles in math. So I might think of a student at risk, though that's also risky. I'll say something about that in a moment. But I don't use that language with students. Research also suggests that students who expect to struggle with a course or subject are more likely to struggle in that course or subject. So if they go in with the expectation they'll do badly, this is what can be addressed by working with them on mindset. If you haven't read about growth versus fixed mindset, Google on Carol Dweck. I could do a whole presentation on it, so I won't right now. Other research suggests that instructor expectations also affect their interactions with students. So sometimes that students who the instructor expects to struggle with a course or subject are more likely to struggle. So my question there is, how do I identify to instructors students who may need a bit of extra help without essentially making that a self-fulfilling prophecy where the instructor on a subconscious level treats the student differently, and that can affect their success? I don't have the answer to that one figured out yet, so if you do, please let me know. All right, so I appreciate your being here for this talk. We should have some time for questions now. I'm also happy to answer questions. Any information I can give you, if you send me an email, I'm happy to respond to, as long as the answer isn't in my office, because I won't be allowed back into it for a while. But all my files and data are in handouts and such on my computer. So I'll turn it over for questions.
All right, thank you. So we had a few questions come in, and you managed to answer a number of them as you were going through, so good on you. One that we did have that you didn't address directly, so someone had asked that you had mentioned attendance being a major factor in the passing rates. Is there anything you're doing right now with having to work remotely?
That is an excellent question and something we've talked about. For the next 3 weeks, which is the period we've already said we're going to be closed, and probably for the time after that if we remain remote, we're just not going to give time on task grades. We talked about some options for switching over to using Hawk's time or moving it online. But we feel like right now for our students, there are so many moving pieces and things changing and adjustments for them to make that we don't want them to have to get their head around a different and new system of assigning those grades. So we're just going to use the grades from the first 8 weeks of the semester for that category, with the caveat that if students had a low grade for the first part and want to bring it up, they can work with their instructor to figure out, what their instructor would want to see to bring up that grade. So in that case, they might say, if you put in a certain number of Hawk's minutes per week, we'll raise the score.
Awesome, thank you. That was a good question. All right, and then one other one that was asked at the beginning was you were talking about sorry, let me scroll. Where did I lose it? There it is. That you have a large lab set up and that you'll have multiple classes in there. Are those divided or are they sort of all intermixed when they're in there?
Sort of in between. So in the first couple of class sessions, we seat our sections by rows. So we'll write up, if your instructor is so-and-so, sit in rows 1 through 3, so-and-so 4 to 6, so-and-so 7 through 9, just so instructors can get a sense of who their students are and vice versa. On the first day, we sometimes, if we have students in different level classes, sometimes one instructor will have an 076 group and one instructor will have a 707, 708 group. That would be prep for college math, the introductory class, and algebra mastery 1 and 2 in the other. we'll actually take the more advanced students out of the lab that first day, because the things they need to talk about are going to be different from what people were doing in class do. But after that first week or so, we don't really enforce a seating plan. So mostly they tend to stick to the area where they started off, but there is some drift and mingling.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Let's see. So that was all the questions that were asked, and then, like I said, there are a few others, but you did answer those. But I will go ahead and highlight one of them here. And they had asked, and you pointed it out, but I thought it might be a good thing to cover again. So I was asked that the green, yellow, red report is extremely detailed. So you had said that you create this yourself in Excel, or?
Yep.
Okay. And it's awesome. They also wanted to make sure they saw that. So awesome.
Yeah. And if anyone wants to see the file, I warn you, it has some ugly formulas in it, because I know about enough Excel to use a hammer. So all Excel problems are reduced to nails. But I'm certainly happy to, obviously I can't send you student data, but the basic code I'm happy to share.
Thank you. All right. But all right, well, it looks like we're just about out of time then. So thank you very much to Professor Mitchell for doing this presentation. And thank you everyone who attended today. We greatly appreciate it. If you have any additional questions, you can feel free to direct them to marketing@hawkslearning.com. Or if you had any that you really wanted to ask of Professor Mitchell, he's still got his email up on the screen, so write it down. But we'll be emailing out links to all of our completed sessions after they are done at the conclusion of the virtual summit. So thank you all very much.
Yeah, thanks so much I know it's a chaotic time for many, so I really appreciate you taking the time to come to this.
Thank you all.